Good morning, and welcome to the Venice Church of Christ Virtual Assembly. My name is Dan Szeto, and I am so grateful for this opportunity to bring you the lesson this morning. If you're just joining us for the first time, I would like to acknowledge that I am not the regular preacher here at the Venice Church of Christ. That honor goes to Ethan Longhenry, who has been doing an incredible job of helping us to continue to worship and study the Lord's Word together as we're adapting to these remote times. This morning, I would like to talk to you all about something that we need more than ever, but are finding it harder and harder to find. And no, I'm not talking about Clorox wipes or even a Nintendo Switch. I'm talking about patience. Patience on so many different levels. Around 8 months ago, our world started to change in a way that nobody was prepared for. And it's been an emotional roller coaster ever since. And much like a real roller coaster, it started with a slow and steady climb to a high peak and then took off like crazy after that. There have been twists and turns and even crazy loops where the world has felt upside down. There was a never-ending rush of information, warnings, updates, and what seemed like a consistent chain of unfortunate events. It felt like every time we thought things couldn't get any worse, there would be something that happened to kind of remind us that it could. I say all of this not to be a downer, but to remind ourselves that it's completely normal to not feel normal right now. Because none of us have ever experienced this. And this is a new normal that in our lifetimes has never existed. I remember when all of this started, the most common question that we would say or hear is, when is this all going to be over? When will things go back to normal? Although we still don't have a universal schedule or an exact date or timeline when things go back to normal, we do know it's going to take some time. And that's why it's so important, more than ever, to turn to God right now, to help us to get through this, to strengthen our ability to have patience in these challenging times. Because our patience is connected to our well-being, from the smallest to the largest aspects of our lives. It also directly affects how we interact with those around us and influence those around us and impact those around us. And with so much fear and anxiety and anger in the world, we really need to strengthen how we're interacting with one another right now. But this is much easier than said than done. We all know it's important to be patient on an individual level and a group level, but I think we can all agree that being patient is much more difficult than it seems. For example, when it comes to the simplest or smallest things, our patience can be continuously tested, and many a times we fail those tests. How many of us have been behind a car at a stoplight, and the second that stoplight turns green and the car in front of you doesn't immediately go, you feel like laying on that horn? I don't have the scientific evidence to back this up, but I believe the reaction time before you actually want to hit that horn is 0.00001 seconds. This is because as a culture, we've been constantly taught and sold on the idea that faster is better. Think about some of the things that we hold most important to us right now. High-speed internet, video on demand, real-time updates, information at our fingertips. It's all about instant gratification. I'm constantly telling my 2-year-old son, Wade, who I love dearly, by the way, that he has to be patient when he just yells out what he wants. But at the same time, I get annoyed when I click on something on Netflix and I see that little loading icon for like 2 or 3 seconds. And while these examples are very real, they aren't even scratching the surface of the more serious and difficult things about lacking patience right now. Right now, as stated, we live in a time where normal foundations of what we're used to have been shaken up, and there are very real unexpected difficulties being presented to us. And everyone wants solutions, and they want answers, and they want them now. Even with the entire world working towards finding a solution to fighting this current pandemic, things can only move so fast. Unfortunately, it has become clear that we're going to have have the ability to wait patiently because this pandemic is going to take some time to get through. And this is very difficult for us because we're not used to having our lives disrupted for such a long period of time. We're not used to enduring extended periods of time where it's difficult to work, travel, or even just socialize with family and friends. To be completely honest, we're not used to having to endure extended periods of times where things are less convenient for us. So over time, we become impatient and we start taking risks. We start to test the boundaries. We allow ourselves to give up or give in to all the negativity around us because we aren't getting what we want right now. And sometimes giving into the negativity actually feels good. And when you're upset or angry, being patient is the last thing on your mind. It's when you usually make mistakes or bad decisions. This is nothing new. If we look at the Bible, we can see many examples where God's people have grown impatient despite what they know they have to do, and the consequences of their actions are very real. During Isaiah's day, Israel was threatened by enemies like Assyria. During those times, God sent prophets with his words to tell Israel how he wanted them to respond. But one time, Israel became impatient with God's timing. The danger was too close, and the odds for their success were too small. If we look at Isaiah chapter 30, starting at verse 1, we hear it stated, "Ah, stubborn children, declares the Lord, who carry out a plan, but not mine, and who make an alliance, but not of my spirit, that they may add sin to sin, who set out to go down to Egypt without asking for my direction, to take refuge in the protection of Pharaoh, and to seek out shelter in the shadow of Egypt." This was the opposite of waiting on the Lord. Israel became impatient. God had not delivered them from their enemy in their time, or the way that they had hoped, and their patience ran out. They sent to Egypt for help. They made a plan and a treaty, but this was not God's plan and clearly stated by his displeasure of their actions because of their impatience. It's a clear illustration of the impetuous side of impatience. Many of us fall into the same scenario where we charge ahead with our own plans, with our own thoughts, without stopping to consider if it's in alignment with what the Lord wants. If we continue on to verse 3, we can clearly see the Lord's reaction and displeasure to this. "Therefore shall the protection of Pharaoh turn you to shame, and shall the shelter in the shadow of Egypt to your humiliation." We see the Lord lay out the consequences very clearly in those verses. Essentially, their impatience is going to backfire on them. Egypt will not deliver them. Instead, it will be their shame. Their impatience will turn out to be their own humiliation. That should be a warning to all of us. Even though the context may not be as relatable to our current day or our current day-to-day lives even, the message is still sound. That oftentimes we act out of impatience and our outcomes end up being the opposite of what we intended. We act in haste and we act without alignment with God, and we are more likely to bring shame instead of glory to ourselves. If we look at 1 Samuel chapter 13, we can see another example of the dangers of impatience. He waited 7 days, the time appointed by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattering from him. So Saul said, "Bring the burnt offering here to me, and the peace offerings." And he offered the burnt offering. As soon as he had finished offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came. And Samuel went out to meet him and greet him. Samuel said, "What have you done?" And Saul said, "When I saw that the people were scattering from me, and that you did not come within the days appointed, and that the Philistines had mustered on Michmash, I said, now the Philistines will come down against me in Gilgal, and I have not sought out the favor of the Lord. So I forced myself and offered the burnt offering." And Samuel said to Saul, "You have done foolishly. You have not kept the command of your Lord your God, with which he commanded you. For then the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." Saul, in his impatience, disobeyed God and took it upon himself to offer the sacrifice during his own timing, which cost him his position of king as Israel. Although it was disobedience that cost Saul his kingdom, It was his impatience that caused Saul to be disobedient. We can see another clear example of God's people being impatient in Exodus chapter 32. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves together to Aaron and said to him, "Up, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." After Moses had delivered his people out of Egypt, they still had a long and difficult journey ahead of them. For 40 years, God led Moses and his people through the wilderness towards the promised land. And as we can see from the verse that I just read, along the way, God's people became impatient. They lost their faith. They began to doubt, and they looked and tried to turn towards their own solutions instead of trusting in God. If we jump ahead to verse 7, once again, we can see God's displeasure in this impatience and actions. And the Lord said to Moses, "Go down, for your people whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way that I commanded them. They have made for themselves a golden calf, and they have worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, 'These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt.' And the Lord said to Moses, 'I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, in order that I may make a great nation of you.'" Sometimes the consequences of being impatient can seem small, but can lead to more than we can imagine. Frequently, impatience forces us to do things without considering the outcome. And as a result, we fail to fulfill our intended purposes. Even though patience can be challenging, there are so many reasons why we must continue to work on being patient. Patience is a virtue. What does this really mean? In simple terms, it means that the ability to wait for something without frustration or getting upset is a useful skill and a good aspect of being one's personality. As you might have guessed, there have been quite a few times with my 2-year-old Wade where he was being quite the opposite of being patient. I do want to preface once again, he is an incredible little boy and I love him to death. He'll grow up and see these lessons and he'll laugh. So, like any good parent, I've tried to explain to Wade that being patient is a good thing and that we are going to work on being patient. I would say, "Patience, Wade. It's good to be patient." But and many new parents may have found out, like I did, the inevitable why question comes into play. So recently I have been reading articles about how to teach a child how to be more patient. And I came across a study that happened in 1968 at Stanford University. In this study, they presented a bunch of very little children a single marshmallow. And they told these children, "If you do not eat this marshmallow, if you wait for a certain amount of time, we will reward you by giving you 2 marshmallows." Well, follow-up studies showed that the children who were patient enough to wait for the second marshmallow actually statistically showed much more success in getting good salaried positions and suffering from much less addictions or struggles in terms of addiction in the future. So the next time Wade asks me why he should be patient, I'm going to tell him it's so that you can get a good job and stay out of jail. All joking aside, it's very important for us to see that with patience, we're able to step back and regroup instead of aggressively reacting hastily or giving into something or even giving up on something. We're able to invest meaningful time into something without giving away what we originally set out to do. Being patient also gives us the strength that we need when things feel out of control. Even as patients, it's very easy for us to get distracted from our goals. Fortunately, God has provided us with so many examples in the Bible to show us why and how we need to be patient. If we look at Abraham and Sarah, we can see a real strong example of patience and receiving the promise of God. Starting in Genesis 12. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and from your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be blessed. So that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." God promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations, and he promised him and Sarah this when they had no children. And even though Abraham was considered a strong man of faith, he did make some mistakes along the way, and he did have a child with Sarah's handmaid, but God still fulfilled his promise in his time. It wasn't until Abraham was around 100 and Sarah was 90 years old that God gave them their son Isaac. Though it took years of patiently waiting, they eventually received the promise of God. In Hebrews chapter 6, at verse 15, we see, "For when God made a promise to Abraham, since he had no one greater to whom to swear, he swore by himself, saying, 'Surely I will bless you and multiply you.' And thus Abraham, having patiently waited, obtained the promise." Probably the most well-known, I won't say best, but the most well-known story of patience that's referenced most frequently in the Bible is the life of Job. To prove Job's faithfulness to the Lord, God allowed the devil to destroy everything Job owned and held dear. Job was a wealthy man. He lost his crops, his property, his cattle, and his servants. But the most devastating of all was when Job lost his children. However, Job did not blame God. He accepted that God had a plan and would be patient for God to reveal his plan. Often people will talk about the patience of Job. He knew God had a plan and was willing to accept that God allowed this in his life. And in the end, God restored Job twice as much as he had in the beginning. In Job chapter 42, starting at verse 10, "And the Lord restored the fortunes of Job when he had prayed for his friends. And the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. Then came to him all his brothers and sisters and all who had known him before, and ate bread with him in his house. And they showed him sympathy and comfort for him for all the evil that the Lord had brought upon him. And each of them gave him a piece of money and a ring of gold." Even without reading further into all the verses that detail Job's suffering, we all know that Job had so much to endure. That the strength of his patience is shown through how he chose to respond to the extreme amount of difficulties and hardships that consumed his life, more than hopefully any of us will ever experience. Having the ability to be patient and continue on the journey with God can help us to understand that consistent hard work and reflection can generate more successful outcomes in our lives, even if this consistent hard work is extremely difficult, challenging, or can even be emotionally taxing. Patience is also important in forming a strong personal relationship with the people in our lives. Expressing patience towards someone shows how caring and supportive you are towards them. On the other hand, being impatient not only brings unnecessary frustration into our lives, but it also significantly stresses us out. We don't need to add any extra stress right now, especially when we're dealing with our current situations that are already filled with so much uncertainty and anxiety, to tell you the truth. So how do we become more patient? There are many ways that you can become more patient, but no matter how you approach it, it takes time, it takes effort, and it takes faith. As Christians, we know that wherever there's been patience, there's most likely faith, and that God has shown us repeatedly the two work together and support one another in most every instance. In James chapter 1, verse 2 through 4, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let that steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing." Hebrews chapter 6, verse 12, "So that you may not be sluggish, but imitators of those who, 'who through faith and patience inherit the promises.'" 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 9, "For the The power of patience is a working power. When our faith may waver, it is patience that comes to faith's aid to help it stand, and vice versa. There are so many occasions in the Bible when patience is mentioned that you also find some form of faith. Faith and patience together always seems to produce a winning combo. In order for us to properly develop the power of patience, we must know what the Bible says about trials and tribulations, because it has been shown that through trials and tribulations we develop patience. As Christians, when we are faced with these difficult times and we find it challenging to be patient, we need to take a moment and reframe the situation. Feeling impatient is not just an automatic emotional response. It involves conscious thought and beliefs. Patience is directly linked to our self-control. And so when we can consciously try to refocus our minds towards God and His teachings, we will find the help we need to react patiently in any situation. We need to practice being more consistently mindful in our thoughts and actions. Once again, turning towards the lessons of God. This has taught us that it will help us to be less impulsive and enable us to feel less overwhelmed no matter what is going on in the world. Whether you're hoping to return to work, or even just hoping that the quarantine will lift, or honestly just waiting for the day when we don't have to be separated from one another anymore, patience is the name of the game. It's true that patience is a virtue, and we are definitely being challenged to develop it right now. But we should take comfort knowing that God is with us, and He has shown us throughout time that we must be patient, especially when times get tough. And being patient, we are able to remain focused on what's really important and not to get caught up or too distressed with what is happening in the moment. It is important for us to turn towards the lessons of God so that we can be encouraged and encouraging one another, that through our patience and faith, we can be uplifting examples to those around us who are feeling overwhelmed. We are currently facing struggles and problems that many of us never faced in our lifetimes. We can feel forgotten, we can feel alone, and yet the hardest struggles we face have the greatest potential to teach us patience and endurance, like nothing else can. This time can feel like our own desert wanderings right now, but this period of our lives may prove to be our most power-packed, strengthening, faith-building time of our life. But we may not fully recognize it until we've gotten through it, and so we must be patient. And so sometimes when we find ourselves overwhelmed, we just need to listen to that calm reminder from God. My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. In whatever we're facing, be assured, God is with us. He's providing for our needs. He has a plan. We just need the patience to see it through. I would like to thank you all this morning for taking the time and the patience to listen to my lesson this morning. Thank you, and God bless.